mindfulness, alertness, and great caution arise. The root of the teachings is keeping the pratimoksha vows. Bless me to accomplish this essential practice. I have fallen into the sea of samsara, so have all other migratory beings. Bless me to see this, train in supreme bodhicitta, and the responsibility of freeing migratory beings. And if I develop only bodhicitta but I do not practice the three types of morality, I will not achieve enlightenment. With my clear recognition of this, bless me to practice the bodhisattva vows with great energy. Once I have justified distractions of wrong objects, clearly analyze the meaning of reality. Bless me to completely in our mind stream the unified path of abiding in special insight. Having become pure vessel and trading in the general path, bless me to the gateway to the fortunate ones, the supreme Vajra vehicle. At that time, I'm having to accomplishing the joyfulness is keeping the pure vows in Samaya. As I have become firmly convinced of this, please to practice these vows and pledges like my life. Then, having realized the two stages, the essence of the Vajrayana, practicing with great effort, and then to pick up the 4 sessions, with the general teachings of the Holy Guru. Like that, may the choose to have the noble path and the spiritual friends who practice that have long lives. Please bless me to testify completely without any hindrances. In all my lives, never separated from perfect gurus, may I ignore the magnificent Dharma. Completed in the qualities of the stages and paths, may I quickly attain the state of Vajradhara. I go for refuge until actually wait that what I have to do. Sorry, that's for the teacher does that at the beginning of the teaching. Sangye chudam zugi chudam la jondu badu da de gapsuji dagi chudin gi betsudam ki drula bendu zang bajo sangye chudam zugi chudam la jondu badu da de gapsuji dagi chudin gi betsudam ki drula Zangi rupa jo zangi chidam zagi janam la jandu badu dadi gipsu Dagi chudin gibe zonam ki drola bendu zangi rupa jo. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. So we've been talking about the 10 non-virtuous actions, which of course is in the context of the discussion of karma, right? There's thinking about the general characteristics of karma and then dividing it individually and reflecting on those. So that has showing that there's 10 main paths of action, and then discussing what those are along with their results. So last week we discussed killing and stealing. So this week we begin with sexual misconduct. So this is the topic. Here I am discussing it in front of monks who, of course, for monks, this is less relevant because your vow is for complete celibacy. All the details of what is and is not sexual misconduct don't really apply, because for a monastic, everything is sexual misconduct, any kind of sexual act. But there are also lay people listening, I think, online, and also it's good to know what these are, and also to be able to teach others in the future, and just for awareness. Again, there's reflecting on karma. What is the ripening of karma? And thinking about this is also a helpful way to want to be celibate, because you think about all of the problems you can get yourself into through sexual activity. However, it's also a bit of an uncomfortable one to talk about in some sense, because a lot of the points are rather controversial, right? For killing, I don't think anyone, I mean, unless they're very, I don't know, if they have a very strong philosophy about particular things, but generally speaking, I think everyone agrees that killing is wrong, right? Some people, I think at least people who are listening to this teaching, probably even if they have killed somebody, wouldn't necessarily justify it by saying, well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually quite unusual. It's said that people, actually, I've read that I think there's some percentage, but it's the high percentage of murders are due to the person, a kind of sense of justice. It's not just like the person is, just randomly killing somebody, or because of desire, but oftentimes it seems to be that the person thinks that they're justified in what they're doing because this person wronged me in some sense, or whatever other reason. And then with stealing, I don't think most people think that that's okay. There might be certain details, like I said last week, about like copyright laws and things like that. That is disputable. Some people might have different opinions on that. But when we get to sexual misconduct, that's a lot of differences of opinion. And I would expect that most people who are listening to this teaching, because most people who get involved in Buddhism, especially in Western countries, tend to be more on the liberal side, not always, then they probably disagree with some of what's said in here. So regarding that, there's a few things to say to preface that. One is that I've often said, if I give teachings on this, um, I've only really given a thorough teaching on this once to lay people when I talked about refuge vows, that I think, for one thing, I think it depends on culture. What is not considered sexual misconduct. Certain things like rape, for example, I don't think that's really cultural. I don't think in any context that's not going to be appropriate. But other things like certain sexual acts or certain partners, it depends very much on what is acceptable in that culture. And so in regard to that, I feel a little uncomfortable as a monastic telling lay people, you can do this, you can't do that. For one thing, it's important to know that in Buddhist philosophy, sexual conduct of any kind is a natural negative action, right? It's not a prescribed negative action. Like some people sometimes think that we monks don't engage in sexual intercourse because the Buddha said not to, but just sexual intercourse by itself can be positive or negative. In the Buddhist understanding, it's naturally negative because it's motivated by attachment. Um, if somebody really could have, the point is, it's not really possible to have sexual intercourse not motivated by attachment. There's different degrees of it. Somebody might do it, for example, some people, because they want to help somebody else get pregnant, who wants to get pregnant, and it's sort of an act of generosity. But the actual act that they're going through, they have to have some level of desire in order to engage in the act, as long as they're doing so willfully. So that just increases sexual desire and increases attachment. And it said that attachment to the desire realm, that's what keeps us being born in the desire realm, which is where there is suffering. In the form realm, there's suffering. And it's mainly sexual attachment. That's the main reason that we're reborn. So it's not a judgment. It's not saying like it's sinful in the eyes of God or something like that. It's just a matter of cause and effect. That sexual attachment leads us to interest in the desire realm, and then continuing to be born there and continuing to get caught up in samsara. So then within that, to delineate what is proper conduct and what is misconduct, it really depends, where do we draw the line, and how do we decide if it's all negative? It's a matter of where do we say this is too negative and this isn't allowed. So what I would say is, if I was to redesign the rules in some sense, which I think maybe is necessary in a new culture, is that it should be decided upon by lay people. It seems to me a little inappropriate for monastics to tell lay people how to behave in that way. I know that in the Catholic Church, as I understand, some people, that's a cause for them to lose faith. That the priest, who doesn't actually have any experience of what he's talking about, is telling them how to manage their sex lives. But at the same time, I think it's useful to reflect upon what is said and what are the reasons why these might or might not be misconduct, and to think that, of course, the point is there is misconduct. It's not just any sexual activity is okay. When I was in college, I remember one of my classmates, who was a bit of the hippie type, I guess you could say. We were doing community work together at the school. I think we were cleaning the grounds or something. And he was talking to me, and he said, just sort of in his reflection, he said, I think sex is one of the few things that's just completely pure. There's nothing wrong with it. It's 100% good, right? So it's to kind of counter that thought process. I mean, you could, I didn't say it to him at the time, but I might have said things like, well, do you think rape is okay in that case? But also, well, what about if you have sex with somebody and then they cheat on you and you feel hurt by that or something like that? And it's not just a minor thing. It's one of the major causes, or quite likely the most significant cause of mental anguish for most people, is romantic relationships and losing them, not finding who you want, but then they leave you, or they die, or they can no longer satisfy you, or whatever. So it's good to think about, and how can we? It's like we have a very powerful tool, and if we use it incorrectly, we're going to harm ourselves and others. Also, in terms of what is delineated here, as far as I understand it, most of this is not specified by the Buddha, because that's important also to recognize. I never saw it in the Vinaya. The Vinaya is mostly about what's the rules for monks. It almost seems like the rules for lay people are a bit of an afterthought.
because it's like there's 5 precepts. It's okay, it's straightforward, don't do that. Now we get to all these many, many, many rules for the monks. And so, as I understand it, I remember reading Alex Berzin had talked about this, that he feels this, like what Vasubandhu put in the Abhidhammakocha, which is similar to what we follow. You'll see it's mainly based on that in Ashvaghosha, was based on certain thought, what was considered appropriate at that time in India, which would have been the 4th or 5th centuries. And anyway, in Berzon's opinion, he says, for example, because one of the main things in here is that it considers that oral and anal sex is sexual misconduct, which basically would imply that someone who can't engage in homosexual sex. So he said that Alex Berzon's feeling is that at that time there was an association of homosexual activity with a certain, well, I can't imagine he would have said, maybe it was Persians or something, but some group of people who were coming from outside of India. Yeah, I was about to say Arab Muslims, but that doesn't make any sense because they didn't even exist yet, and also that I don't think that in their religion it's appropriate either. But yeah, it may have been Persians. So there were Persians coming into India, and they were engaging in this, and so that was sort of like that's what they do. We don't do that kind of thing. And I know still in India it's a big thing. I mean, up until what was it, 2000? What did they change? Do you know when they changed the law about this? 2018 was it?
Yeah, they legalized
Yeah.
gay marriage, then they just a few years later reversed.
Well, that was gay marriage. I think it was just gay activity.
Well,
And I think in 2009 they decriminalized homosexual activity, and then a few years in 2013 there was a backlash. I think mainly from Christian and Muslim groups that I heard, and then they made it an actual. It made it, was it in the Constitution, or they changed the Supreme Court basically in India. They changed the law that it was basically life imprisonment if you were caught engaging in any kind of homosexual activity. But then they revoked that a few years ago. I was at 2018, maybe, I don't remember. So, but obviously, it's still a big issue in India. There's still a lot of people who feel this isn't appropriate. So it's sometimes a reflection of that. So if we live in a society where that's not considered inappropriate, and I don't see it as particularly valuable for Buddhists to come along and insist that it's inappropriate, because there's no real reason in here that's stated. Why is that not okay, but something else is okay? Now I even know some Tibetans who I've talked about and who are, and most of them aren't this way, that as far as I know, but I know like a couple, 1 or 2 that have specifically said they think homosexual sex is wrong. And I asked them why, and they say, well, because, at least in one case, he explained, well, because the purpose of sexual activity is childbirth, and is not doing that, so what's the point? But then my argument, well, then you might as well argue that lay people can't use contraception either, because it's the exact same problem, right? So anyway, I mean, that's a totally different question, and whether or not, whether what people's views on this is different, and we could have a different discussion about that. But my point is that anything in here needs to be kind of explained. What is the reasoning behind this, unless it's considered a very hidden phenomenon? Now, if there was a specific quotation from the Buddha saying this is wrong for this and this reason, or just even just saying it would be something as Buddhist that we would take seriously. But I haven't seen that. So it's important to reflect on it, but it's at the same time, it doesn't mean that it's binding and that we have to necessarily accept it if we don't see it as if it's, as the Buddha said, if it contradicts scripture or contradicts reason. Things are not fixed in these cases. So anyway, with that said, I'll read through it and just we can reflect on it. And beyond that, I think it's good to preface it that way. Otherwise, I think especially lay people listening might be offended by hearing about it. So, loper yembe jini. And so yem is sexual activity, right? And lok is wrong, right? So the basis is this fourfold. So jukpa chawa mayempa means an object in which you should engage, like a person, right? The wrong person. And then yenlak mempa means the wrong orifice, right? The wrong, in Vinaya, Yenlak means the male member, and then the go is usually used for the female. But here I think it's Yenlak is talking about the orifice. And then ne mayimpe means the wrong place, right? And then du mayimpe means the wrong time. Duma beji. So de la damboni. So, and again, it's very clear this was written by men for men. Tsongkhapa also, of course, was celibate from a young age, so he didn't have experience with this per se. I think mainly he was just doing it based on what he'd read in the Ashvaghosha and Abhidhamma, but it's just assumed that the reader is male. By the way, it's worded here, right? So it's a woman who is not an object of intercourse. Dropachawe pume, dropachawe mimpe pume. Oh, and kepa. Okay. Well, no, I see. And then all men. So right, that's the point. It's talking to men, and it's saying a woman who's not a right object or a man. A maning, which means a neuter, right? That's a lot of question in Abhidhamma, not in Vinaya about what that actually means. There are many different kinds of neuters. We had 10 that we had discussed in the Vinaya, and I think there are more. That's also a very relevant question about in terms of who can ordain and what does it say in the Vinaya about that. But I think it's the main thing is, in this context anyway, it's a person who is neither male nor female. They don't have either sexual organ or they have both. So anyway, the point is here that's considered misconduct in this context. So damboni, so what is the meaning of a woman with whom you should not engage in intercourse? So duale, this is by Asanga, right? Mala sopa tang me sumpala sopa. So your mother and so forth. So incest is the point there. And then me sumwa means ones who are guarded by the mother. That's not entirely clear, right? I might take it as like an adopted child. Maybe that would be one way to understand it. Like your brother, who's your sister, who's adopted by your mother.
Stepsister.
Yeah, stepsister. I guess that you'd say that. Yeah, but I'm not sure. It might just mean people who are protected by their mother. It doesn't make it clear here. And dole jike zumpa namni. So then, as it says in the sutra, drupa chawa mipa shichaho. So the sutra says, object for whom you shouldn't engage. It doesn't say anything more than that. She sungla. De dun lopon tayangi. So here's Ashvaghosha says, he explains the meaning of what is not an object. Dropa chamin shechini. So what does it mean? That's not object. Shen zong. So somebody that's held by another. I think the idea there is adultery, right? Somebody else is married to them. And then chuki gelsen den, somebody with religious insignia. Basically a monastic of any sect. Somebody who, I mean, really, it doesn't say they have to be celibate, but I guess the idea is that they're in a religious position of religious authority. They're wearing their religious clothing. Riki song, so one who is held by caste, right? So again, this is very much a cultural thing in India that you're someone who's a different caste, you're not supposed to engage in sexual intercourse with them. And Gyalpo song, so they're held by the king, right? So the king would be angry if you engaged in intercourse with them. And Shengi lampe metsong, so a prostitute who's already been hired by somebody else. Right. So as he goes on to say below, in this context, it's not in general considered wrong to have intercourse with a prostitute. So that's another thing where it might go the other way. I think in modern culture, it might be considered misconduct. It depends on which country. And in our country, I think it's illegal as far as I know. I mean, in most states it is. I know for the people who are the prostitutes it is. I would assume for the people who engage in it too. So then it would be, you'd think about whether it's morally right or wrong, the question of breaking the law and doing things that thereby bring bad reputation upon Buddhists. Or for lay people, they would want to be careful of that. But here it's just saying that somebody else has already paid her. And so it's their property in some sense at that time. And a Nedudak means relatives. So in the Vinaya also, there's a lot of talk about relatives, not in this context, but there's many of the vows for monastics that aren't a downfall if it's a relative, like begging for clothing and things like that, because they're people who it's okay to ask them for a lot of things because I told you it's fine. I'm your mother. You can ask me for money if you need. So there's a lot of talk. What does it mean to be a relative? How far do you take it? And there's in terms of, it says in terms of, if you look in terms of genealogy, I guess we'd say, it's 7 generations back. That's pretty strict, right? Like, meaning that if you have the same, what would it be, great 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 grandfather, then you're a relative, right? So I don't know. That's it seems a little hard to identify, right? You might not know. But then it says the other way to do it is in terms, which probably is more relevant, is in terms of what is considered a relative in that society. So what would people find offensive? Right. So then in that case, it says even if in that society, it's not considered, I don't know if there is such a society, but it's not considered problematic to have relations with your mother or your sister, then they're not considered a relative in that context. So one way that in the Vinaya that's relevant is like, you shouldn't touch a woman, even I mean, with attachment, of course not, but with someone who's a relative, as long as it's not out of attachment, out of sexual attachment, then you can touch them. But it says you should not touch non-relatives, because even if it's not out of attachment, because people they won't know. So if you're in a society where it's considered okay to be married to your sister, then you shouldn't touch your sister because people might think that something's going on. So similarly here, I think that kind of depends on the culture. In many cultures now, not so much now, but much more in the past, it was okay to marry your cousin. It was pretty normal. Whereas nowadays it would be considered quite inappropriate. So nedu tandrawa, nedu dak tandrawa tang. So those with you have a relation. I'm not sure what that is. And then derak drocha mimpayen, right? So those are not the right object. Let's see if he says anything in here. Yeah, those. It doesn't. It just says nedu dak tandrawa. He takes it as one thing, so related as your relatives. I'm not sure if that's what it's actually saying. Right, nedu is relative, and then drawa is relation, but it might have some other connotation. Sheizun bataro, and a shengi sunwani shengi chungmaho. So yeah, somebody that's held by another is somebody else's wife. And chugi galten jenny rab jungmaho. So yeah, so in this context it says one with religious insignia means a female of Rancia. Right, so a woman who's a monastic. And then Riki Sumbani. So yeah, what is it? So this is one that I was taking as caste, right? Riki Sukba. So Bakmar Sunwa. Bakmar Masoma. So Bakmar Masoma means, Bakmar is a bride, right? So Bakmar Masoma, who has not gone as a bride. Let me check on that too. Not yet become brides. I guess the idea is that the parents are kind of waiting to marry her off, and then they would be offended. I mean, that happens certainly. There's stories of that the father is not wanting the daughter to engage in intercourse. That happens a lot in India. I read. I mean, you probably know about that, right? There's a lot of cases in India, like as I know, with very traditional families. If the daughter engages in intercourse, then she's considered spoiled, and they can't marry her off anymore. So it's a really serious thing. I read about a murder case some years ago near Delhi, where that was the factor that led to it, and the father murdered them. So that's the kind of thing you have to be aware of, the effect it's going to have on other people, not just on what I want or what you say we're in love, but we also have to take into account the impact on other people. So the rangi pa la sopeña, so the relatives of one's father, which would seem to be your relative, right? It says protected by father, but that's not. Nyen means relative, right? I'm not sure. And then nenam gugyuk So gu gyuk, yeah, is your gu gyuk. That's there's a different kinds of relations. Yeah. So gu gyuk is father and mother-in-law, I think. Gu and gyuk. Gyuk am and a gosong am. So gosong is a person who guards a gatekeeper. Yeah. Those are protected by a guard, I guess. Yeah, those who they have a bodyguard or something. Derak mena rangi kyang suho. And if not, then I mean, they're protected by themselves. We can take it, or one that you're guarding. I think because the translation has protected by themselves, but I think it might mean because that doesn't make a lot of sense. What does it mean protected by themselves? But I think it means you're assigned to protect them. You're assigned to guard them. And so the father says, "Please guard my daughter so she doesn't get involved in sexual activity, and you can get involved with her." Right? That I think that's the idea here. And a gyalpa tang kube sumpani. So those are those who are held by the king or somebody appointed by the king. Means de la chepe trim chepo ho. So there's been a law made against it. Right? There's just also in the sutras. There's one example of this. It's an interesting story, and it's an interesting question about what should be done in that context. But there was a what was it the king the king ordered them to go to war, and so the general was going off to war, and he either the king or the general, I forget who, made the law. You know, if any of our wives engage in adultery while we're gone fighting, then we're going to execute them. And so they came back, and the general discovered that his own daughter, or I think it was his own daughter, not his own wife. His own daughter had engaged in adultery while he was gone. I mean, maybe he just engaged, maybe she was supposed to be waiting for him to be married. I don't remember. But anyway, so by his law that he had made, he was obligated to execute his daughter. And he decided he should do that because he didn't want to go back on his word. So he was going to do that, and she got very terrified and fled, and she went to the nuns community and said, "Please accept me as an aspirant," because she wanted to be protected from getting murdered, for getting executed. So the nuns did ordain her, but then it created a big controversy, and the king was like putting troops out to the nunnery to get her. So the Buddha made a rule for the nuns that they should not ordain somebody who is basically, sentenced to death, or that the king is out looking for her, because it's too damaging for the sangha. They can't be there to protect them. I mean, in the sense of like that they could take them in and say, well, we don't kill this person. If you're going to kill them, you have to kill us first, or something like that. That might be a different way to deal with it. But then to ordain them, it created a lot of controversy for the sangha. And I think what happened then, I think what ended up happening then is that they turned her over to Queen Malika, right, the queen, who was a Buddhist, and she protected her because she was able to, right. The nuns didn't really have any power to protect her, but the queen did. But anyway, yeah. So the point is, if in this that's in the context of the monastics, but here we're talking about, so if the king has made a particular law not to engage in intercourse with this person, then it's saying don't do that. So basically the point is don't break the law of the country. And then, I mean, of course, then you'd have to, I mean, that's the question. What would you do? This is, I said, it's not really up to the monks to decide. It's more the lay Buddhist, I think, who have to think about this. What if you're in a country where, or even just in a state in the US, where not these days as far as I know, but where it's illegal to have interracial marriage, right? Then is it saying you shouldn't do that? Maybe you could do it as a kind of protest, right? But these are again, it's difficult questions, but it's important. Again, in any decision we make, we have to be mindful of the consequences, even if we don't necessarily agree with the way the law is, and maybe I might even break the law, but we have to be aware of the potential consequences and not just treat it as no big deal. So Shengi La Shewe Meitsongwa. So yeah, like that's what it says before. Shengi La, someone who's already paid for this prostitute. Lokiam du Sumpe. So he's saying because that's called sexual misconduct, Rangi La Jimpa Lokiam Mepar Dendo. He says that so implicit, it's saying that if you paid for her, then it's not sexual misconduct. And then Jo Chempo Kyang, Derandrawa Sungso, saying then Atisha said similarly. And then Kepani Rang Shen Nikala Chao. Right, so yeah, so a man is oneself or another. Right. So if you could engage in intercourse with yourself, that would be misconduct. Right. I mean, that is that you've been in the Vinaya, right? You can't you have, it says you don't have 3 doors, but you have 2 doors. Right. So it's possible. Not many people can do that, but that would be considered sexual misconduct. But for another man. So right. So here it's very explicitly saying that homosexual sex is misconduct. That's what I said before, that is something that I think we have to look at the cultural background of it, and it doesn't mean we have to necessarily accept it. I don't know of any Buddhist community in America that I'm aware of anyway that forbids homosexual activity or homosexual couples from coming, right? Whereas that is the case in a lot of Christian communities, and it's a major cause for people to lose faith. So I think in some sense it's the opposite. I think that what they're doing here is because they didn't want to be associated with that, because that was a cause for the lay people to not lose faith in the Buddhists at that time, who in the lay people would have thought that, well, the Buddhists accept this kind of thing, we don't. Whereas nowadays it's quite the opposite thing, in many Western countries anyway. And then Yenlak Mimpani, Nilgo Matope Yenlako. So that is a polite way of saying it, right? It says any passage other than Nilgo, it literally means birth canal, right? But you get the point of what he's saying. So again, it's saying anything other than the sexual orifice is misconduct. So I discussed that before, so we don't need to talk about it again. So then Lopon Tayangni, so this is Ashvagosha, Gyanat me Bagangshina. So this is just his source, the same thing. Ka Nang Tang, Ka Tang Shanglam Jimpatang. So the ka, mouth, anus, jimpa is the calves. And then la dampa, so the thighs pressed together. And lapa kupa. And then with the hand, right? And that's also another question, because then, of course, it's implying masturbation is sexual misconduct. So in this context, I was just talking about this with somebody this week that I don't know if any of you know Christopher Hitchens. Ever heard of? Yeah, you might know. Yeah, he died about 15 years ago now, but he was a strong outspoken atheist and a strong critic of religion, right? So he went to the extent of criticizing a lot of people. He even wrote a whole book criticizing Mother Teresa. And he wrote an article criticizing His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And in that article, he basically criticized His Holiness the Dalai Lama's views on sex. I don't know where he got this quotation, but it was probably from His Holiness teaching this text. And he just took it completely out of context. And he just says, look at the kind of thing His Holiness says. He says, using your hand is sexual misconduct. Right? So he said, look at how offensive that is. I mean, I guess his audience is generally quite liberal, so he assumed people would completely agree with what he was saying. So I have to be careful. I'm saying this in a recording. People are going to take all kinds of things from it. So that's one where, it says that in the text, but it's also something I think is useful to consider, right? It's not a judgment per se, but the point is that the understanding is that sexual activity, again, as I said, is in general a negative action. It just increases desire. So doing something like that is not going to help. Right? Even if we're lay Buddhists, although we don't have to be celibate, the understanding is the more you can limit sexual activity, the more ability you'll have to meditate properly, and the more merit you can create. So if you're just constantly engaging in sexual activity all the time, even with yourself, then it's just creating that much more. So if you can set a kind of boundary about that. And I also think when I studied Chinese medicine in college, it's talk about this, and I think it's relevant because it's also how the Buddhists see the world or understand the human body. In Chinese medicine, they talk about different energies in the body, and there's Jing energy, which is sexual energy, and if you just waste that, it is the energy that could otherwise be used for something else. And that's the understanding in Buddhist physiology, is that there's energies in the body that if they're not used for one thing, they can be utilized for, in this case, for especially for monastics, for meditation, but also for lay people, that if they can conserve energy that they can then use for meditation, it's a much more virtuous thing to do with that energy. So that is something, I think is, again, worth considering. But as I said before, I don't feel comfortable as a monastic making a strict statement that this is right or wrong. I think it's up to people to think about for themselves about what is appropriate. So then Jo Chempel. So then, as Atisha said, Yanlak Mimpa. So I have a note here. It says in the translation actually that this is not a quote by Atisha. It's misquoted. But in any case, so it says Yanlak Mimpa Shechawani. What is called not the right orifice? It says the same thing. Mouth, anus, ka tang shang lam tang, keu tang pumo gapki puka. I mean, that's pretty. I don't think it's a question even of the orifice there. It says a boy or a girl's front or rear orifice. Right? I mean, I don't think it matters which, what the case is in there. It's more that it's a young child. There's obviously sexual misconduct. And then rangi lakpo, so run one's own hand, right? Shepa tantuno, he's saying that accords with what he said. So then ne mimpa, so the wrong place. This is also useful to contemplate because the main point is that it offends other people. We don't just have sexual intercourse in any place, any time. So lama tabu namgi nien kortang. So when you're in the retinue of your lama, right? I don't think the point is in public, but just like if you're staying at your lama's house or something like that. And chudengine, so in front of a stupa or at any kind of religious site. And then keo mompo ngonsum. So this is in front of many people. And then yu dela nupe sacho. So in a place that harms the other person somehow. I'm not sure what that would mean. I have to think about it. I mean, maybe that it puts them in a dangerous situation that somebody knows about it, that should know about it or whatever. But somehow that the person with whom you're engaging in the intercourse, that it's not a good place for them. And barbunchen, so uneven ground. I don't know what that would mean. And then sawa, hard ground. I guess that's just because it's uncomfortable. I guess the idea is that it's talking to men, so it's saying be considerate of the woman. It's going to be uncomfortable for her if it's on hard ground. It's and I guess that's the same idea with the uneven ground. It's not explained what the problem is. So then Lopon Tayangi, so Ashvagosha says that a yu mimba shechawani. So what is not the right object? It says damchu chuden kuso tang. It's the same thing. So in front of the holy dharma, in front of reliquary, in front of a statue. Jandesempe shukne sok. So in a place that is a place of abidance of a bodhisattva, right? So I think the idea is, again, your lama. It's just you're in the place of a holy being. Kempo tani lopon tang. So with your, I mean, that's, I guess, because you're a lay person, but it says like with your preceptor or your abbot, but maybe it just means in general with preceptors or abbots. And then pama trona nepani. So then abiding in front of your parents, right? Maybe just at your parents' house, I'm not sure. And then yumin teru meicheo, so the wrong place. It doesn't explain what that is. Shesungde. So Jo Chenpo Kyang, again, he says, then Jo J also says that. But as I said, the translation in the footnote, they indicate that it's a different text that he's quoting. So I'm not sure. Dumipani, so the wrong time. Datsen zakbo means when the woman is having menstruation. And then dawa sangwei druma. That should be the same thing. Dawa sangwei. Oh, I see. Okay. So, yeah, I see. Dawet sangma means, so druma is a pregnant woman, right? So it says when she's in the late term pregnancy, I think is the point, that the months have fulfilled. So dawet sangma. And then nusha zakbe bu chunga. So a woman who's nursing a baby. Chipatang. Nyene tang. Nyene la nepa. So then that's a woman who's abiding in a religious fast, right? They're taking 1 day vows of celibacy. And then trikpa chemirongwe ne tang. So a woman who has an illness that makes it uncomfortable for her to engage in intercourse. Tandempa tang. Sule lapa ho. So here, this is sometimes people joke about this particular passage that says it shows that Songkapa was not experienced in this. It says too many times, right? And then he says, this is Songkapa's commentary. Tsuni lengai bar de chipo, right? So up to more than 5 times in the night. Right? So that would be too much. But it doesn't actually say that the translation says night. It doesn't say that here, but I would assume that's what he's talking about. Then lengai baru chipo ho. So then Lopun Tayangi, so Ashvagosha says, the dumin, dela dumin chawani, so the wrong time is datsin zaktan drumatang, right? So is menstruating or pregnant. Buchung, also with a young child, it's all the same thing. Tanche, butang, puchung tangche, mimo tang, she doesn't want to, mimota. So that would be rape, right? And then duga himide soktang, so she's unhappy or suffering, right? She's not in a good mood. Yanagede, gene, dumin, yeah. Yanage means having the 8 vows, right? The 8-day precepts. 8 one-day precepts, yeah. So, dumin, yin, those are the wrong times. She sungde, jo chempo yang de tan drawa la kiperni. So, saying again, Atisha says similarly to that, but the difference is, nimo du kyang dumin du zedo. So for him, even the daytime is the wrong time. It has to be nighttime. Yala mimba so sumni. So now what is the wrong orifice? We already talked about that, no? Oh, I see. So it says these 3 things, the wrong orifice, the wrong place, or the wrong time. It says if that becomes sexual misconduct, even with your own wife, then no need to speak of somebody else's wife, right? Because already it's sexual misconduct because it's somebody else's wife. So rangi chungma la so chalayang logiam de gyurna shana tapshimo. Sambala sumle. So now that was the object, right? So now what is we have the motivation and the perception, right? For any of the negative actions. So dujeni, I talked about this briefly last week, right? So there the dushi she matrua go persungla. So it needs to be unmistaken, right? Whereas it says duale, so dua are totally different things, right? Dua is the talahapa dua. It's the you said the name last week, Vinish Samuchaya something. Yeah. The compendium of ascertainments by Yosanga, which is a text about bodhisattva practices, right? Versus the dua is a Vinaya, right? In the Tibetan it sounds very similar. So mitsangchigi pampala dushe tru matru drawar sungsa. So in the Vinaya, the perception does not make a difference. I talked about that last week. Right? That's a very important thing in the Vinaya, that it's one of the few cases where the perception is irrelevant. So the point being that if you don't know who it is that you're engaging in intercourse with, or if you were mistaken, it's irrelevant to whether you're breaking the vow. But for a layperson, it's relevant because you think it's your wife. It's very different than if you intentionally are engaging in adultery. Right. So Zhedralni, it says in the commentary, the auto commentary to Abhidhammakosha, Rangi himpe dushigi Shengi chungma gendu songna, chume gendu songna, lelam migirwatang. So if you think it's your own wife, but it turns out to be somebody else's, that's not a complete action. And then shenshiki chungma la dele shepe yin bers du jene, shupala girwata migirwe luk ni shedo. So then it's a question. So if you have the perception as your wife and it's somebody else's wife, that's very different. But he says, what if you think it's one wife, somebody else, but it's somebody else's wife, a third person's wife, right? So you're mistaken, but in either case, it's incorrect. He says there's two different ways, there's two different systems where they follow on that. I mean, technically, if we were to have the general system of having to have an unmistaken perception, then it would not be a full action. Just like I said, in the understanding is if you intend to kill one person and you kill somebody else, it's not considered the full action of killing. It doesn't mean it's not negative. It's still very negative, but it doesn't have the complete action because it was a wrong perception. So here, if it were the case that, if I think it's his wife, but it's somebody else's wife, then if it's still a downfall, then it actually is saying that the perception is not completely necessary. Or you could have a mistaken perception in certain context, but still have the full downfall. So then, nyomo ni dusum ganrongo. So any of the three poisons. I said that's the same for the other ones, right? So it could be that your attachment, that's most likely, but anger, that you're raping somebody just because you're angry at them, or out of ignorance. So that would be like that you're engaging in a tantric ritual and you think this is going to bring liberation. Your misunderstanding of what tantric practice is, then you engage with, that could certainly happen, even if it's not a tantric ritual per se, but just a sense that that some belief that if I engage in sexual intercourse with his wife in the tantric context, it's okay, or something like that. Right? So that would be ignorance motivating the action. And then kunlongni mitsampa chepe droa dopaho. So that's clear that out of a wish to engage in sexual intercourse. I mean, really, the word mitsangcha, right? It's abramacharya, right? Is that right? The opposite of brahmacharya, of pure behavior. And joani duale shenla lokyam chid jupayilayang jupapala lokyam gi kanamatoa kiprsunga. So it says in Dua that even if you incite somebody else to engage in adultery, it's still the full action, right? So that's an interesting point, because for stealing and killing, it clearly is. If I hire somebody else to kill, it's still killing. It doesn't make any difference really in terms of the degree of negativity of the action. Now in the Vinaya, that's actually different. It's the opposite. It says that of the 4 defeats, sexual activity is the only one you cannot break if it's not you. Right? It doesn't. If I ask somebody else to have sexual intercourse, it's not good to do that, but it's not a defeat for the monk, right? Because you have to be the one doing it. But here, it's saying if this would be a bit of a different question. You encourage 2 other people to engage in adultery, right? Or you hire somebody else. Maybe why you would do that, but there could be various reasons. So he's saying that in Asanga's text, it says that is the negative action, but then in Zodra, or by Vasubandhu, Detubula ngoshi lelam mepar shede. So as for that, it's not the full negative action, right? So then Kalpa is saying, well, maybe what Asanga meant was that it's not the full negative action. Doesn't mean it's not a complete negative, not a negative action. It's not the complete negative action. I mean, what it comes to my mind, again, as I said, now we're finished with this section, but it's, as for lay people listening, as I say, it can be a cause to lose faith, and so it's important how we talk about this. And I was thinking about Bertrand Russell. I don't know if any of you know about his writings on sexual activity, which is they say that's although it was not specified, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, even though he was a philosopher. But it's generally understood that the book that kind of tipped him over the edge to win the Nobel Prize was his book on sexual conduct. Right? He was had a very liberal attitude about that. And he he had many reasons for being against religion. But one of the strong ones that he thought that it was very repressive of sexual activity, like just people engaging in sexual activity to a healthy way that made them happy and just made them unnecessarily unhappy. But his statement was something like, these rules, for what is and is not sexual activity were made by these ancient people who were themselves not engaging in sexual activity and having these pointless debates without having an idea what they're talking about. So that's a kind of view that people can certainly get. And I feel that a bit when we're talking about here, Asanga and Vasubandhu arguing about what is and is not sexual activity. They're both monks, right? What is and is not sexual misconduct. So as I say, I don't. It's hard for me to take this as especially binding. It's really important to reflect that there is definitely things that can harm people and harm oneself, but at the same time, it's certain, and maybe it wasn't the case. I don't know how people took it in Tibet when they read these things. I mean, it was probably mostly monks reading these books anyway. But I think in today's world, this is definitely the kind of thing that can turn people off to the religion. So it's important to I says qualify it and also think about how to talk about it. So then Tartuk ni nigi ni trepoho. So then, the completion of the action is when the two organs meet, right? The point actually that is relevant, because that's also relevant for monastics, because there are people who have this wrong view, is it doesn't have to be ejaculation or orgasm, right? It's just that the two organs meet. So for a monk, for example, it's a defeat. As soon as you have entry into the organ, it's not a matter of whether there's orgasm or not. So Zundamawani, so now we come to lying. Yeah, please.
So you were saying that sexual activity in general is a naturally negative action.
Yeah.
Because if it is sexual activity, it's motivated by attachment.
I mean, actually, it's not said explicitly why. That was a big point of debate in Vinaya. But that's my guess. Because,
The term says it could be motivated by anything.
That's a good point. Well, I think I would say anyway that you could have the causal motivation could be any of the three, but their motivation at the time has to be attachment. I would think, I mean, if you're doing it willingly, right? If somebody's forcing you, it's a very different question. But if it's willingly done, the person, at least for the male, it's really kind of impossible without any kind of lust to engage in activity. I mean, I guess for the female, in the woman, it's like she just wants to make her husband happy or something like that, and then just lets him do what he wants. So in that case, yeah, I guess you could say it's not necessarily done out of attachment. So that's a good point. So yeah, I mean, I think we did debate these kind of things, right? It's not specified in the text, and even so, there are some people who argue that it's not naturally negative because it doesn't ever, that I remember in the text, very explicitly say that it is. But there are many ways that it's worded where it's quite clear that's what they're talking about, right? Like one of my classmates, his position was that it's talking about monks. And so it's saying for a monk, any kind of sexual activity is naturally negative because it's, but I think there were, because we did debate about this and we kind of turned around on him and said, well, then this wouldn't, if that was what they're saying, it wouldn't logically follow that this or this thing. I can't remember some of the points, but it's not totally clear, but it definitely generally understood. And I think, although there might be exceptions to it, I think it is something important to reflect upon. I think that is the point here, that, as much as I say I don't want to judge people for what acts they engage in or this or that, or that I think that lay people need to feel that they can't have any kind of sexual activity. I do think it makes some sense to think about it that way, that it's not, in the long run, in the short run, it might benefit people in the sense, I mean, of course, having children or something like that, but also that you're trying to comfort someone or whatever, but it just ultimately leads to more attachment. And it ultimately, especially in a future lifetime, it leads to a very strong attachment to a physical body and to reincarnating in a particular form and to sense pleasures. Whereas it's not conducive to liberation. It doesn't, some people might have that idea, either if they have a belief that tantric sex is going to bring liberation, or just that they feel that, well, being happy and having sex is going to help me be a more happy person, and then eventually I'll have liberation as a result, or something like that. I think it's quite clear, because that was a clear thing, and it was in one of the sutra stories again. As a monk, one of the downfalls is to spread wrong views, and not, even when told to not do that, not say that, to refuse so. Right, so you can see how that would be very harmful if somebody went around the sangha saying this is okay, but the Gecko says don't tell everyone that, but you just keep saying it. So that happened in the original origin story, that one monk went around saying it's okay to engage in sexual intercourse. It's not an obstacle to liberation, and they said no, it is. And so that's generally that much, at least, is very explicit, that it's an obstacle to liberation. And so it would seem that that would imply it's a negative. It's naturally negative if that's what's happening. Yeah.
On the Jirinpoche wrote the Lajin, he wrote for lay people, or is it for monks?
Well, I don't know, and no lay people read it, but I think mostly for monks, yes. Because, for one thing, at that time in Tibet, the majority of educated people were monks, right? Most of the lay people couldn't read. And most of his students were monks. It's been that way for most of Buddhist history, right? Even at the time of the Buddha, it's clear that there were lay followers, but they didn't really know much about the Dharma, right? It was just about that they liked the Buddha and were inspired by him, and they wanted to be sponsors or this or that, or they would want to follow particular precepts. Like, there's a story in the sutras, Ananda Pindada, right? Or Ananda Pindaka. I think it's Sanskrit and Pali. It's different, right? Yeah. Yeah. So Gome Sejin in Tibetan, right? He was the major lay sponsor of the Buddha. I mean, there are many lay sponsors. The most renowned lay sponsor. He sponsored the first monastery, for example, and was Buddha's follower for many years. And when he was passing away, then Shariputra, I think it was, then he said something to him about some Dharma teaching, and contemplate on the suffering of the aggregate, something like that. And he started crying on the Padaka, and he said, I never knew the Buddha's teaching was so profound. Why don't you share this with lay people? And so he'd been his follower his whole life, and he never even had a teaching on the Four Noble Truths. So it seems that it was not a normal thing to teach lay people. It was just assumed that they wouldn't understand or whatever. I mean, again, through most of Buddhist history, most lay people weren't educated people. So it's very different these days, right? In the modern world, most people are educated, and most people approach the teachings in a very different way. So they're not content just to come. That's also, you'll see the difference between, if you're in a Western Dharma center, like in Boston, for example, we have the Dharma centers, which are mostly attended by Native American people. I mean, people who are born in America, right? Versus the cultural centers like Thai temples, Vietnamese temples, Cambodian temples, which are mostly from people who immigrate, and maybe been born in America, but at least first generation immigrants from those countries. And in the Western Dharma centers, it's very much teaching centers. Whereas the cultural centers, it's very much about doing prayers together and making merit and making offerings, right? So that in their culture, that's very much what lay people do. But it is changing a lot now, because even in those countries, people are much more educated. I think I mentioned this to you before, that in Thailand, as I've read, that has also really changed the monastic culture, because Thai people are much more educated now. So the monks have to be a lot more careful how they behave, because the lay people aren't just going to be taken in by anything. They know how a monk is supposed to be, and the monks as a result have to be able to explain themselves in a more reasonable way, right? So that's a totally different question. But anyway, so I think most of these writings, it was just assumed most of the people reading it were monastics. So I was thinking, what it made me think about is just Tsongkhapa did have lay followers, and the stories of his life, it's like they were the sponsors. You have I'm forgetting some of the names. We're supposed to memorize them for our exam, but other than that, there's not a lot of talk about that, what they did, right? I mean, there are lay lamas. That's a little different. In Tibet, that was a tradition that's not in many other Buddhist countries of having lay lamas and ngakpas, right? So that is actually quite different thing. But for the general populace, I don't think it was assumed that most of them would have been reading this. And that's, even today when the lay people from the local camps come here, they can't understand most Dharma teachings because this language is not what they speak, right? Especially debate language, but even just language of the Lamrim Chenmo. It's like I remember talking to one Tibetan woman in Dharamsala who, she was Tibetan. I mean, she spoke very fluent Tibetan, obviously. So we were talking in Tibetan. But she was telling me that when she attends His Holiness's teachings, she listens to the English translation because she can't understand what he's saying in Tibetan.
Oh, really?
Right? Yeah.
She can understand it in English.
Yeah, but I think in English that it's all terminology that people know. Right? I mean, she was also fluent in English, but the point is, even if you're fluent in Tibetan, in modern colloquial Tibetan, you wouldn't understand the kind of language they're using in a Dharma teaching. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, like just remind me, it's quite similar in like a lot of Theravada countries.
Yeah.
Like lay people when they study Dhamma, they actually will study like in English translation.
Right,
Because
yeah.
There's like in Sinhalese or Burmese or like.
Well, it's in Pali, isn't it, in a lot of places?
Oh yeah, but
Yeah.
the government nowadays, like
Okay.
Sri Lanka,
Okay.
try to translate it like
Into Sinhalese and Burmese, yeah.
nobody can read it 'cause
Really?
English is too elevated.
Really? Yeah. So it's like that.
They just
Yeah.
read English.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, it's sort of a side point here, but it's very important to know that and think about that. I mean, you see what we study here. It's a lot of it is very advanced. It's like again, Lexog used to feel that way. He felt that sometimes he felt that the Tibetan approach was like almost getting too much, like overcomplicating the Dharma. My feeling after having studied her all these years is I think it really is valuable. I don't think it should be that we just discard it because I've gained a lot from all these years of going to debate and debating these texts. I don't think it's good to just offhand dismiss it, but at the same time, it's a couple things. One is that it shouldn't be thereby that we think, well, the Dharma is too profound. There's no point in teaching lay people because they won't understand. And that's part of why Lama Yeshe was so, innovative. Right? I mean, we take that for granted in the West. We're kind of used to that now, but he was criticized by the other Tibetan monks for the way he was teaching, and it was very, you can read his biography. I mean, they got to dismiss what he was doing. It's like, what are you doing with your time? But also, it was very, innovative, or what's the word? Like, it was a totally different way to teach. It wasn't like he was teaching the way that he was taught to teach. He came up with that himself, pretty much, the style of teaching, and then Lama Zopa Rinpoche very much followed in that. I mean, Lama Zopa Rinpoche also hadn't even really studied much at Sarah. Lama Yeshe had pretty much studied the whole Geshe studies program, but so there's that aspect of it, that how do we teach it to lay people, but also for ourselves, right? Like, I think for my own practice, if I'm in retreat, or for example, I don't really. It's like, in some sense, I use a lot more simple ways of contemplating, but I think the value of the study is that all of what I study informs how I contemplate on things. It's sort of, I know it in my mind, and so it makes a big difference in terms of the way I think about things. But a lot of these very esoteric points that we study, it's like, that's even the Lamrim itself, right? We were talking about the Lamrim Chenmo being kind of hard, inaccessible, but this is very simple compared to reading, studying Parchin or Uma, right? It's like it's all just condensed into very, very easy to understand points. So it's sort of even understood that it's not, you don't necessarily use those for your meditation, but it's sort of like, it's like being a great scientist. You have to know a lot of very detailed background theory, but actually applying that oftentimes in experiments is much more simple things. Or like being a great doctor, You need to know all kinds of things about the body, but can you perform surgery on someone also has to do with these very basic things of how you move your hands or something like that. Right? It's not just a matter of intellectual knowledge of the whole body, but that certainly is going to help you if even if some very minor thing comes up, you know all of the details of why that's happening. So, how did we get on that topic? What was your question? Yeah, who was the audience, right? So, yeah, it's good to think about that. But not all of Tsongkhapa students were you were necessarily the greatest scholars. Like there's the one who was, I forget his name, something Ngawang Drapa, I think, the one for whom he composed the three principal aspects of the path, right? I had thought he was a layperson, but my classmate was saying no. I'm not sure how I got that idea, but I don't think he was a layperson, but he was not a real scholar type, and especially like Lama Umapa, right, who was also Tsongkhapa's teacher, right? He was the one who channeled Manjushri. He had not really studied at all. Or no, he did study some. I don't know how to say that, but he started out and he was a farmer, and then yeah. So it wasn't totally for like great intellectuals. But generally is for monastics, the students. So, okay, so lying. Zundamawe jini. Tanwa tipa chedak chepa number shepa. Shitang. So, dele dopa jide. So, what you've seen, what you've heard, and chedak chepa, and not what you know with your mind, but chedak chepa, like dividing the instances. Says they're just distinguished, I guess, like what you've ascertained by yourself, right? And tele dopa, so that the opposite of that, what you haven't ascertained, what you haven't seen. Koche yu, so that's the point, is that's the object of lying, right? So something that you see and you say you didn't see it, or something that you didn't see and you say you saw it, or something you know, you say you don't know, or you say something else, right? And then goche yu is the person who's hearing. So who are you lying to? So paropo tonkoho, so a person who understands what you're saying. Right? Sambala suma. So then the intent, the thought has three: the perception, the affliction, and the intention. So the dujini tawala matang war girbatang. So changing what you saw to what you didn't see, right? Saying that you didn't see it when you saw it. Matobala tongwa, matangwala tongwa duje girwa. So then changing what you didn't see into what you saw. Duje girwa sokso. So it's interesting in the translation. I was looking at this because it's actually been a question for us. It's in Vinaya too. Dushe girwa, what does it mean to change the perception? So they take it as that you perceived it one way, but you say you perceived it a different way, right? Which may be correct. We're going to get to this in chapter 4 of Abhidharma, so later this year, because we all were uncertain in Vinaya when we came upon this term. But in Vinaya chapter 4, it's explained. Because my understanding of dushe gurwa meant that you change somebody's perception. That's what it means to lie to somebody, that you have to speak in a way that changes the way they understand things. They thought it was one thing, but you make them think it's another. But it could be that you have that perception, but then you change it. You had the perception that it's this, but you say it's this, something else. Say it's that. So nyomong means sumo. Again, any of the three nyomong. So you could lie out of attachment to get what you want. You could lie out of anger because you want to deceive somebody and put them in harm's way, or you could lie out of ignorance that you think it's an appropriate thing to do. So then kunlong ni du shegire mawar dobaho. So that you out of the wish to change. That's why I would say it has to do with them. Out of the wish to change perception, right? You wish to change their perception, the wish to speak mawar dopa. Jorani, so the actual action, mawaham chang miwawe dangdu lembaham. So you speak, or even without speaking anything, you assent. Right. So, like somebody says, "Wow, you look like a very pure monk." You say, right? Now in the Vinaya, that's not a defeat, actually. I'm trying to remember. Actually, that's important, right? I think it depends how you say it, right? So in the Vinaya, if somebody says, "You look like you're enlightened," right, and you just go like this, I don't think it's a defeat. But if you were to say, "That's right," I think that is a defeat because you said something. But it might even be the first one. I don't remember if we clarified that point, right? Because it's assenting to what other people say. But the point here is that in terms of the action, it being the action of lying, it's irrelevant, right? You're communicating to them some way, and they understand it. And the main thing in the Vinaya is that the communication has to be explicit, right? So if you imply something, at least for a monastic, it's not a defeat, and it's probably the same here, right? So they say, "You look like you're enlightened." You say, "Could be," right? It's pretty strong, but it's not literally saying it, right? So it has to be explicit. That's what you're communicating. So tandu lempa, lug your way, send me. So that's that you with your bodily gestures, right? So you could say sign language, but just so like there's an example in the Vinaya also of this, right? Of a monk who what is it? He's sitting on the crossroads and he sees a deer go this direction, and then the hunter comes after later and he says, "Which way did the deer go?" And he says, right. So it's a lie, although it's also a question. It does actually say at least in our Vinaya text that lying is not always negative, which is interesting because it's considered a naturally negative action, and generally speaking, nothing as a naturally negative action ever has permission in the Vinaya. But then it's a bit of an esoteric, but it's hard to get exactly what they're saying. So there's a lot of debate about this point. But it says the reason it gives is that an ordinary person can measure the damage done by their lie, but they cannot measure the damage done by their action of killing. So like you could think, "Oh, I'll just kill this person to save somebody else." You can't predict what's going to happen as a result of that, how harmful it could be. But with lying, you could. I mean, I would think in some cases you can't, but in that, you do it like that. I mean, the worst thing that happens is the hunter doesn't find the deer, right? It's pretty unlikely they're going to find out you were lying, although they might. That could also have a lot of consequences, but
You need a good motivation to tell lie with a good motivation.
well, that's what I'm saying. It's implying that is okay in the Vinaya. It's saying that lying in context, it could be actually a positive action, right?
Wouldn't it just be better to say, "I'm on an accident, so it wouldn't be appropriate for you to tell you"?
Well, you could say that, but then he might guess the right side, right? You got him in the wrong direction, then there's no way he's going to catch the deer, right? Or he might get angry at you for saying that. You don't know. There's another story in the Vinaya. It's kind of, I don't know if it's really that relevant, but it's like I think that's where that story comes up. The one about the gesture is not actually written there. I mean, just people talk about it this way. But actually in the story in the Vinaya, it says, the hunter says, "Did you see the deer?" And he says, "I did not truly see a deer." Right? So the words aren't a lie, but it's a lie to, is it Jochala mizun, kochala, not zoom, but there's kochala zoom is the idea. Like the words are true, but in terms of what the other person understands, it's a lie. Right? Because they don't understand that you're saying there's no truly existent deer. The point is that they understand it as you're saying, "I didn't see a deer." So it's deceiving them, right? But I don't know if many people try to get away with it that way. So, Tirzun tan trama tang siksumbo sumla chue liang. So here, chua means to entrust or like give to somebody else, right? So the lying for divisive speech or for harsh speech, they assume the gyurwa sungshing. So it still becomes the negative action, right? So if I incite somebody else to lie. Whereas in the Vinaya, that is one difference, right? So if I say to you, "Go and tell everyone that I'm enlightened," and then you do that, and you know that I'm not, and we know it's like a mutual understanding, but I want you to lie on my behalf. That's not actually a defeat. It's still very negative. It's bumble, but you have to speak the words yourself or make the communication yourself. Whereas with killing and stealing, you don't. Part of the justification for that is it's not quite as negative of an action. So it has to be, in order for it to be fully a defeat, still very negative, but it's not, doesn't require, directly, it doesn't require that you, it does require that you say it yourself. Yeah.
And regarding, for example, the pure vision that I have to have to our guru or teacher,
Yeah.
for example,
Yeah.
and we tell all the people, oh, my guru is so enlightened and he's very nice, he's a Buddha, but if the guy is not a Buddha or is not enlightened, he's a lie.
I mean, do you know he's not?
I don't know. From my
Well, that's he is.
I
mean, there's two things to say about that. Yeah. Well, there's two things to say about that, right? For one thing, it's definitely not a lie if you know that if you don't know one way or the other, right? But also it depends upon the context, right? Like I think in our context, we're Buddhists, we understand that if we say my teacher was enlightened, he was totally enlightened being. It's like, we understand that side of the devotion. It's not holding you to an account of that you've actually accessed this with your own perception and seen and know it, right? Whereas if you say, I know my teacher's enlightened because I had many experiences of his clairvoyance because he told me this or that, even though that didn't happen. That's very different, right? Then you actually implying something that you have some kind of evidence that you didn't see. But if you just say it, it's like people kind of understand it's your opinion. It's not that you're making a statement about factual things. But anyway, so for the defeat, you need to do it yourself. But here it's saying, even if you incite someone else to do it, it's still the non-virtue of lying. Zot sadrel do nagi shika lachue nagi shika lachuel delam de gyurwa sheda. So in here, it's saying, here is not clear what he means by here, because he says first, here it's talking about for those three, but in the Abhidhamma Kosha Vaisya, that the auto commentary, it says all four. But then where does it say only three? It doesn't. I'm not sure the point there. It says all. So even inciting other people to engage in senseless chatter is just the same as doing it yourself. I could see why you might separate them. I mean, it might seem like it's not quite as negative to ask someone else to engage in chatter than to waste your own time. But anyway, in Zo, it says it's all four. Dualeni, Dedaki Tarduki Tuma Kepala. So in order for the full downfall to have been committed, Rangi Mepagoba Zungso, right? You have to say it yourself. Exactly. That's in Vinaya. Right, so the point is, in Vinaya, to have the full downfall, you have to say it yourself. Right? And so in the Vinaya, the speech, all of the negative actions of speech require certain things to be present. Right? Whereas killing and stealing and sexual conduct are the three where there's the least qualifications. Right? Like you kill anybody, it doesn't matter if they're, the wrong object or whatever. The point is you killed somebody. If you steal from anybody, it really makes no difference. Whereas, and in sexual conduct, it's the same thing. But for lying or for any of the negative actions of speech, there are certain things that have to be fulfilled, and you have to have a certain way of saying it. They have to have certain qualifications, and so on and so forth. So there's more like leniency. Isn't quite the right word. It's not like it's okay, but in order for it to be fully a downfall, it requires quite a few more factors to be present. And one of them is that you have to actually say the words yourself or make the gesture yourself anyway. Yeah, I think the gesture would have to be considered the downfall, because there's one thing in the Vinaya about that you don't have to speak to lie. And the example they give is that if you go to Sojong and they ask you, because at Sojong, when they say Nebula Neba Tongla, 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 Jinjilepa Domla, it's like, do you see your next action as negative? Will you restrain yourself, right? So at one point also they ask you, if you don't even hear probably what the abbot is saying, but he's saying, if anybody has committed these, please speak up. If you're remaining silent, I assume that you haven't, basically. So if you remain silent as if you didn't do it, if you didn't do anything, but you know you did, then that's considered lying. So you didn't even have to say anything, but you're making it clear, right? So it's a bit, I mean, in Sojong, in our Sojong anyway, people don't actually speak up, but the understanding is that you're coming to Sojong, it's making the statement that I'm pure. I didn't do anything that prevents me from being here. Right? So if you did a very serious action, you didn't tell anybody, you just show up to Sojong. Now, as a Gelong, we do the blessing, right? So say 5 minutes before Sojong, I engaged in something very negative, not a defeat, but like a very serious action that I need to confess. It doesn't mean I can't go to Sojong, but you do the blessing at the beginning, meaning, bless me to be pure to do this. I promise to confess later, because that way now you don't have to hold everyone else up while you're going and confessing it. But the point is you're promising that you will once the conditions are present. So, okay, so Tarduk, so the completion of the action. Paropo kohyende, so the other person hears what you're saying. Mokona, si kyawat samdu drowa zodra leshedo. Right, so if they don't hear you, then it just becomes idle chatter. Right? Now, again, it's a little different in the Vinaya. If they don't hear you, it's not a full action, but it's not just idle chatter. Right? So there's in the Vinaya, of course, they come up with every possible permutation. So it says, what if a monk goes out in the cliffs and he just yells, "I'm an arhat," and then it echoes back, right? Nobody hears what he says. So that's still a negative action, but it's not a defeat. Nobody heard him, right? So here, though, it's saying it doesn't even imply that it becomes an incomplete action. It's just saying it becomes a complete action of idle speech. You're just wasting your speech. Although I think it would have to be. It would have to be understood that way. I mean, it's really surprising if it would say that it's not, an incomplete action of lying, which is probably more serious than a complete action of idle speech. Yeah, it says the same thing there, but that would be a point of debate, I suppose. Anyway, this is also in Zu. All right, it's what he's saying here. Yeah, it's in chapter 4 also, so we'll get there this year, and then I'll see what they say about it. It says they need Trambaran supply on draws with the same thing for divisive speech and for harsh speech, that if they don't hear you, it's not the complete action. So maybe we have questions. It's 15 minutes left. And do you have your phone? You can check the chat also. So the other people if anyone's online live, you can send messages to the chat. But if not, any of you here also questions?
No questions so far.
Yeah. But you have questions? Any of you?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for the naturally negative actions,
Mm-hmm.
then let's say lying is a naturally negative action,
Mm-hmm.
then the virtue would be refraining from lying.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that purely negative? I guess it's sort of a debate point.
What do you mean?
Negative phenomenon.
Oh, well, it's not exactly, because it's very different to not lie versus refrain from lying. Right? You could not lie your whole life just because you never got a chance to do so, versus having the intention not to lie. That's what a vow is, essentially. That you're saying, you're making a strong commitment, I'm not going to lie, and then reaffirming that, such that you have that motivation. That becomes considered a very strong action. Right? So that's a positive action in the sense that the intention not to do it and the intention to refrain. That's why the word that I have said, it's translated as vow, but really dompa means restraint. So you're intentionally restraining yourself. Otherwise, it's not a positive action not to kill. It's just not creating the action of killing. So it's not negative either. It's as you say, it's just a negative phenomenon. Yeah. No other questions? If there's no other questions, we can finish just a little bit more because there's not much left in this section. So trameji, so the basis of divisive speech, semchen tumba tami tubanamso. So it's people who are both concordant and discordant. Right? So you break up people who are friendly or people who are unfriendly, that you make them more animosity toward each other. So then sampala sumle. Now I should also mention, it's also one thing in Vinaya, it says Gendun yechir zunma wa kanamatu che rapchir do. So actually it says among all negative actions, lying is the most serious. Because it says it's because it splits the Sangha. But I think that's the point here. Right? Because divisive speech can very easily also be lying. Right? And it's understood among the negative actions, you have the 5 uninterrupted actions, that the most negative of those are to split the Sangha, because it creates so much disharmony and destroys people's spiritual practice. It obstructs people from liberation. So a divisive speech, probably in many cases, is going to be a lie, that he said this or this about you, and even it didn't happen. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it's true, but it's just saying things that shouldn't be said. So yeah, these are speech, but speech can be very negative, can be very harmful. For most people, most of the negative karma we create is with speech. It is very easy to be very careful with the kind of things we say. And divisive speech, it's not as bad if you don't have the motivation, but it's very easy to create this unintentionally. You say the wrong thing, and then it causes people to become discordant. You didn't mean to say it that way, but if you're more mindful, it might have been less likely to happen. So, sambala sumle, so the intention has dushe, nyomoni, ngarjin. As it was before, you have to basically be unmistaken about what the object is, and then it's any of the 3 poisons. So kunlong ni semchen tumbala yeradopa. So you intend to divide people who are concordant. Semchen mitumbala midubardopo. So then people who are discordant, you intend for them not to reconcile. Dumpa. Right? So they're maybe potentially to reconcile, but you say something that caused them not to do so. So joani dempa tambi dembetsik gayan rongway. So either true or false, he's saying. It could be a lie, it could be a true. But you use them jocha nian minian, or you say something which is pleasant or unpleasant, either way. All right. Jupa tang, guba rangjen gangungi chir. So you say it either for your own or somebody else's purpose. Right? So I'm dividing 2 people because it's beneficial to me, or I'm doing it to help somebody else's benefit. Tarduk ni duale tani yerachawe number rikpachao. So you understand that the completion is when they are split. Shezungde chepetsik mepa koho. So he's saying, actually no, it's not. It's when you do the splitting. It's saying, so it's not that they split. So you can, if you say it's just completing the word, it's not a matter of whether they split apart or not, right? So they don't have to actually divide for you to get the negative action. It's just that you're trying, and when you finish saying the word and they understand you, that's all it takes. Mepako, yeah, so then they hear you. You say it and they hear it. Once they've heard, that's the action. Tiksupe shini, so then harsh speech, tiksupe really means rough speech, right? I mean, that's also important, I think, rough speech is something I feel strongly about. Different people have different opinions, but I feel strongly as monastics that we really have to be very careful what kind of words we use, even if the intention is not bad. Right, so we, like things like swear words. Again, this is very much a cultural thing, but things that people hear and they become offended. I think it's very harmful for the Sangha if people hear that You hear monks talking that way, and they expect monks to be peaceful and kind people. And even if the person is just, that's how they talk, and it's not meant in a rude way, it can come off that way. You have to be very aware of the kind of language we could use that. So I think in general, it's good as monastics to learn how to speak in a how do you say, honorific way, or use very polite language, because it's pleasing to people. And otherwise people might, even if you have a perfectly fine motivation, it can make a very big difference in how they understand it.
You don't think that is about also their expectations about our life rather than, because sometimes I feel a little bit, how can I say, pretending. If I pretend I'm a very, how can I say, correct monk or pure monk and pretend in this way, I don't feel comfortable. I like to be myself. I don't like to pretend that I'm something. I don't feel comfortable. Like to pretend that I know how to speak, or
Yeah.
I speak like very slowly because I meditate the whole day in my room. I don't like this.
I mean, I
Feels
think,
so
well, there's a
fake,
couple things. One is, yeah, you don't have to use the Queen's English. That's not quite the point. And you don't have to speak very slowly, kindly, and you don't have to make it exaggerated, right? But at the same time, I think it's a matter of, like everything, as I said, as a monastic, it's something about growing into it. It's not like you expect on day one, you have to do it this way, but it's practicing that way. It's certainly been the case for me. Like as a layperson, you're a very different person. And how you behave as a monk, it's something you have to grow into. It's not like you just immediately put on robes and you're a different person. But it's the kind of thing you want to try to cultivate. Be aware that people expect monastics to be a certain way. It's like, I have to be me. Well, who is me? It's just a matter of what we cultivate, what we habituate with. And if there's a way of talking that people are going to find this isn't how they expect monastics to talk, it's important to take that in consideration. We don't necessarily always have to do everything everyone wants, right? Especially if what they want is actually out of accordance with the lifestyle of a monastic. But as it says in Shantideva, right, in the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, what is it? Ditamade Gyurvakun, Tong Tong Tride Pawarcha, right? So the things that people don't like in the world, observe what they are and ask what they are, and then abandon them. So you have to pay attention to the culture you're in. I think we're living in India. We have to pay attention to what do Indian people expect. And then we're in the monastery. We have to see what kind of things do Tibetans expect. Right? Like, for example, now in the Vinaya, you're not supposed to urinate standing up, right? Nowadays, so now we have urinals, right? And it seems that most of the monks think it's okay because the point is you're not supposed to just do it out in the open, right? But now it's kind of blocked off. But you'll see if they have there's some places, like if you see monks who will, people do this, of course, they urinate in the grass or in the woods or whatever, right, for males. But you'll see they always squat down when they do that. It's considered offensive to just stand up and do that, right? So I remember early on, I did it the way we do it in our country, right? And then a senior monk actually scolded me. And my first response, kind of offhand, was, well, in our country, we do it this way. And he got kind of angry. And he said, well, that's not how we do it in our country. Right? You have to be mindful of this is what people expect here. And so try to gradually learn that and act that way. Otherwise, people are going to be offended by what you do, right? It's not a matter of what your motivation is per se, but we have to be very aware of what people expect. So yeah, I think it's a matter of developing. It's not going to be the same for everybody, but gradually developing a persona and a way of relating that's natural. That's both natural in some sense, like for you, but at the same time in accordance with what is appropriate for a monastic and what is appropriate in that culture. I mean, being a monastic requires a lot of social skills in a certain sense, right? We have that book in the library, and maybe some of you already know this, Social Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. It's a very famous book when I was younger, but his first book, Emotional Intelligence, that was one of the most famous books that I'm aware of when I was a young person. So Daniel Goleman, I didn't even know this. I don't think anyone really knew this at first. He was a Buddhist. He is still a Buddhist, still alive. But he didn't make that clear at all in his first book, or it's his major book anyway, because he knew that probably wouldn't give him a lot of reputation. But that became one of the most famous psychology books of the 90s, and at least popular psychology. But it wasn't just pop psych, it was very, based on a lot of evidence. And then he later wrote a book, Emotional Intelligence, about 10 years later. Oh, no, Social Intelligence, which is kind of the same idea, basically showing that the different kinds of intelligence doesn't mean intellectual intelligence, and showing how at least the argument of emotional intelligence, which was why it became such a sensation in the 90s, was that it's showing that people who succeed, emotional intelligence is actually more important than intellectual intelligence. People who are great businessmen or whatever other measure of success in Western culture. And it's helpful to read his books. Like, even though it's just reading a book, it's helpful to contemplate on these things and because we have to do that as monastics. We can't just think, I don't care, I'm a monastic, I'm renouncing the world, and therefore I'm not involved in social conventions. Right? We're not involved in social culture per se, but we're interacting with people all the time. And so we have to learn not just intellectual knowledge, but how to read people and how to experience people's emotions and work with that. Right?
Yeah, my point was not about the interact with people.
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
more about pretend be some
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
spiritual person in front of others, you know.
Yeah, but I get. I don't mean to pretend to be spiritual, but I'm just saying learning how to be social as a monastic is an aspect of social intelligence. Right?
Yes.
We've definitely seen that in this house with all the foreign monks who come here, and some of them are very good students, but they have a very hard time interacting with the Tibetans. And some of them, it's the opposite. They're not the best students, but they're very good at blending in here and doing things in a way that pleases people, which is, in some sense, you're creating positive karma by doing that. Right? You're creating, although you don't mean to, you still are creating some negative karma, even if you tried to be nice, but you're offending everybody and it makes everybody unhappy. So we have to be as much as we can, we should practice mindfulness of that and train in it if it's possible, if we need to. Yeah. Okay, so why don't we finish there? Oh, yeah.
We have
So,
one question
okay, that's
from the
fine.
chat. So,
Okay.
Is the mind of concealment a form of lying?
No, because it's not a physical thing, or like so I said, like to how do you say, to to not speak in a way that's deceitful, that is lying, right? So I mean, you could say, as a monastic, if I committed a defeat and I didn't tell anybody, everyone assumes that I haven't, otherwise I would tell somebody. So it's kind of like lying, but it's not quite considered lying. Whereas if somebody pointedly asks me, did you do this? And tell me if you did, and I just remain silent, then it's sending the explicit message, basically, that I didn't do it. But the mind of concealment is a little bit of a different story. Like in the Vinaya, that can accompany any negative action, and that just it compounds it makes it a lot worse, right? So if we do something, and especially if you have a vow not to do something, and so you promise not to do it, and then you do it, and then you have the mind, I'm not going to tell anyone, I'm going to hide what I did, that makes it much more negative. In the Vinaya, for example, with the defeat, if you commit a defeat, there are still reparations that are possible. Right? There are ways, it doesn't mean you can be a pure monk again, but there are ways to repair it and things you can do. It says if you commit a defeat with concealment, then there is no recourse. You're not allowed to associate with the Sangha anymore, because that makes it that much more negative. You're not willing to confess it and work with it and be honest about what's happening. So it's a form of dishonesty, absolutely, but it's not considered lying per se, because it's an action of mind as opposed to an action of speech. Yeah. Okay. Is that anything else there? Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Okay. So we do the mandala first, right? See, yeah. Anyone remember how to do it?
I've been trying to follow, but I'm not able to
Okay,
follow this
okay, okay.
transliteration, but yeah, that's
Okay. 사주보기로 럼리라링임 니대겐바림 상계신도 미대호와김 누구남다일람 주발요제들람에 구제라된 진앙카드레 조조게바람 로산템베 노메사숭기 로엠 젤다둠 애교줌 Okay, wait 1 minute. So actually, I just thought of something, and I think it's a quite important thing to say. So maybe, even though I'm interrupting the prayers, we were asking about, the Lamrim. We were talking about the Lamrim versus the study program here, and I was saying that the Lamrim is much more kind of to the point for practice, whereas the study program is much more abstract in a lot of ways. And so, kind of, what is the value of that, right? If it's not actually what you practice. But Geshe Lexo said in a very good way. I remember one time he was telling somebody about why we study it this way. It's that way when you read the Lamrim, you know all the reasons behind these things. You've thought about it, so it's supported by a lot more reflection. So you know why it's just said that's negative to do this or that. You know why, and you know all of the consequences. So you have a lot more conviction in what you're practicing, as opposed to mainly the Lamrim in some sense is written like a faith-based text. It's just understating this is how it is. But if you've studied it, you've actually questioned these things and gone through a lot of the reasons that led to it being stated in this way. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So we can move on. From my 2 collections, vast the space that I have amassed from looking at the effort of this practice for the length of time, we held the eyes of ignorance. Even if not ought to reach the state, may be held in a loving compassion for all my life's manjushri. I find completed grasp of the teachings, and please all the Buddhas by my practice. Using strong forth of compassion, may I clear the minds of all beings of the points of the path as I have discerned them. May I uphold the Buddha's teachings for a very long time. My going out with great compassion in whatever direction the most precious teachings have not yet spread, or once spread have declined, may yield this treasure of happiness and aid. Those who wish for liberation be granted boundless peace. May the steeds be nourished for a long time. May this graded path to enlightenment completed due to the wonders of virtuous conduct of the Buddhas and their sons. May the numbing beings who eliminated adversity, the excellent paths never be parted in any of their lives from the pure path praised by the Buddhas. One makes an effort to act in accordance with the tenfold Mahayana virtuous actions, and may all be assisted by the mighty ones, and may oceans of prosperity spread everywhere.